Thomas Pruitt was 12 years old when the wall fell on him. Not the whole wall, that would have killed him, but a section about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall that his father had laid too wet and too fast. The boy had been sleeping against it when it slumped inward, pinning his legs under 300 pounds of poorly mixed cob that hadn't cured properly because Samuel Pruitt was too proud to ask an English widow how to build with mud. Mary Hale was the one who heard him screaming. She'd been walking back from the creek, and she stopped at the edge of the Pruitt property, listening to a boy in pain while his parents frantically tried to dig him out with their bare hands. She could have gone for help. She could have run to get her mother, who knew exactly how to cut through uncured cob without bringing more of the wall down. She could have done a lot of things. What she did was stand there for a full minute, watching. I want you to understand why before you judge her. 6 months earlier, Josephine Pruitt had stood in front of the general store and announced to everyone present that Constance and Mary Hale were building a mud hut like African savages, and that decent Christian women don't wallow in dirt like pigs. She'd said it loud enough for Mary to hear from 30 feet away. She'd said it while looking directly at Mary to make sure she heard. So Mary stood there at the edge of the Pruitt property, watching Josephine claw at the fallen wall, listening to Thomas scream, and she thought about that moment at the general store. Then she ran to help. Not because she'd forgiven Josephine, not because she was a better person than her anger wanted her to be. She ran because Thomas was 12 and had never said an unkind word to her, and because letting a child suffer for his mother's cruelty was a line she couldn't cross. But she took her time getting there, a full minute of standing and watching before she moved. And I want to know if you think that minute was wrong. Tell me in the comments. Because I've thought about it, and I'm not sure there's a clean answer. Let me tell you about the walls that didn't fall, and why the Pruitt's wall did. In Devon, England, where Constance Hale was born in 1832, Cobb Construction had been building homes for at least 1,000 years. The cottages her grandparents lived in were 300 years old. The church in her village was 500. They were all made of the same thing, subsoil clay mixed with straw and water, built up in layers, plastered over with lime. The technique worked because of what clay does when it dries. Wet clay is moldable, shapeable, almost liquid if you add enough water. But as the water evaporates, the clay particles lock together into a material nearly as hard as soft stone. Mixed with straw, which provides tensile strength and helps the material breathe, cob becomes a building material that can last centuries with minimal maintenance. More importantly, for the Kansas prairie, cob walls are thick, 18 inches minimum, often 2 feet. That thickness creates thermal mass, the same principle as the water in Silas Cobb's walls, or the stone in Veino Corhonen's masonry heater. Mass absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A thick cob wall heated by summer sun stays warm through cool nights. A thick cob wall chilled by winter cold stays cool through hot afternoons. The temperature inside a properly built cob structure barely moves while the temperature outside swings wildly. Constance knew all of this the way she knew how to breathe. She'd grown up in a cob cottage. She'd watched her father repair cob walls. She'd mixed cob with her bare feet as a girl, stomping the clay and straw together in a pit while her brothers added water and her mother judged the consistency. When she arrived in Kansas in the spring of 1877, a widow with a 19-year-old daughter and almost no money, she looked at the thin wooden cabins the other settlers were building, and she knew immediately that she would not live in one. "They're building kindling," she told Mary. "One good fire and it's gone. One bad winter and they'll burn through more wood than they can cut. We'll build proper. Proper meant cob. And on the Kansas prairie, where trees were scarce and lumber was expensive, cob made even more sense than it had in Devon. The clay was there for the digging. The straw was abundant after harvest. The water came from the creek. The only cost was labor, and labor was something Constance and Mary had plenty of. The technique Constance used had specific steps that couldn't be skipped. First, find the right soil. It cracked heavily, too much clay. If it cracked heavily, too much clay. If it crumbled apart, not enough. If it held together with only small surface cracks, perfect. Second, prepare the mixing pit, a shallow depression lined with boards or packed earth, large enough for 2 people to stomp around in. Fill it with clay soil, add straw, long stems, not chopped, and add water gradually. Then stomp. You mix cob with your feet, Constance told Mary, because your feet can feel what your hands cannot. When the straw disappears into the clay, when the mixture stops sticking to your skin and starts holding together in clumps, it's ready. Third, build the foundation. Cob can't touch the ground directly. Water wicks up through it and destroys the base. A foundation of stone, at least 18 inches high, keeps the cob walls dry. In Kansas, Constance gathered limestone from a nearby outcropping, spending 2 weeks hauling and stacking before she laid a single handful of cob. Fourth, build in lifts. A lift was 1 layer of cob, about 18 inches high, laid around the entire perimeter of the building and allowed to dry before the next lift was added. Trying to build too high too fast, which is exactly what Samuel Pruitt did, caused the wet cob to slump under its own weight. Each lift needed 3 to 5 days to cure, depending on weather. Rush it, and the wall failed. Fifth, compress and trim. After each lift cured, Constance beat the walls with a wooden paddle to compress the surface, then trimmed any bulges with a sharp spade. This created the distinctive smooth curves of cob construction and ensured the walls were solid throughout. Sixth, build the roof before winter. Cob needed protection from rain while curing and from excessive moisture year-round. A good overhang, 18 inches minimum, kept water from running down the walls and eroding them. The whole process took Constance and Mary 4 months. 4 months of digging clay, hauling straw, mixing with their feet, laying lifts, waiting for drying, compressing and trimming. 4 months of Josephine Pruitt walking past and making comments loud enough to hear. "Still playing in the mud, I see. I've heard the savages in Africa build with mud. I didn't know we'd brought one to Kansas. That thing will wash away in the first good rain, mark my words." Constance never responded. She just kept building. Mary wanted to respond, wanted to shout back, wanted to explain that cob cottages in Devon had stood for 3 centuries, but her mother stopped her every time. "Let the walls speak. When winter comes, the walls will speak louder than anything we could say." The cottage was finished in late September 1877, a single room, 18 feet by 24, with walls 20 inches thick, 2 small windows with deep sills, a door facing south to catch winter sun, a stone fireplace built into the north wall. The roof was sod, another technique Constance adapted from Devon, where thatch served the same purpose. From outside, it looked like a rounded lump of earth with windows. Nothing like the sharp-cornered wooden cabins the other settlers built. Josephine Pruitt called it a mud pie with a door. Then November came. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution and tell me in the comments, Have you ever known something was right and had to wait for everyone else to figure it out? That's what that winter felt like for Constance. The first cold snap hit on November 12th. Temperatures dropped from 50 degrees to 14 in a single day. The wind came down from the north like a blade, finding every crack and gap in every building it touched. The wooden cabins leaked heat like sieves. The Pruitt house, largest in the settlement, had a cast iron stove that burned continuously and still couldn't keep the temperature above 45. The Harrison cabin, smallest and most poorly built, had ice forming on the inside of the walls by the second day of cold. Constance lit her fire once in the morning and once in the evening. Small fires, nothing excessive. Her cob walls had absorbed heat from the autumn sun for 2 months, and now they released it slowly into the interior. The thermal mass worked exactly as she knew it would. While her neighbors shivered and fed their stoves, she sat in a cottage that held steady at 55 degrees. By December, the differences were impossible to ignore. The Hendersons had already burned through half their winter wood supply. The Pruitts were buying additional fuel at 3 times the autumn price. The Harrisons had abandoned their cabin entirely, moving in with relatives because they simply couldn't keep it warm enough to survive. Constance's woodpile barely looked touched. Henry Marsh, a different Henry Marsh than the one in Silas Cobb's story, "This is Kansas, not Colorado," came to visit in mid-December. He was a practical man, a former carpenter from Ohio, and he'd been watching the Cobb cottage with professional interest since construction began. "I need to understand this," he said, standing in Constance's warm cottage while wind howled outside. "Your walls are 2 feet thick. My walls are 6 inches thick. You're using 1/4 the wood I am and staying 10 degrees warmer. How?" Constance pressed her palm against the interior wall. "Feel that." Henry touched the cob. It was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air. "The wall stores heat," Constance explained. "Every fire I burn, the heat goes into the wall first, then slowly releases into the room. Your walls don't store anything. The heat goes through them and out into the cold. You're not heating your cabin, Henry. You're heating Kansas." Henry visited 3 more times that winter, asking questions, taking notes. In spring, he started building his own cob structure, a small outbuilding first to test the technique. Constance helped him select the right soil, showed him the foot mixing method, warned him about building too fast. 3 days between lifts minimum. The cob looks dry on the surface, but it's wet inside. Rush it and it falls. Henry listened. His outbuilding stood solid. The next year, he built a cob addition to his main cabin. The year after that, his son built a full cob house. Samuel Pruitt watched all of this from a distance. He never asked questions. He never requested help. He just watched. And in the summer of 1878, he started building his own cob structure. He got almost everything wrong. He used topsoil instead of subsoil, full of organic matter that would rot and weaken the walls. He chopped his straw short instead of using long stems, reducing the tensile strength. He mixed with a shovel instead of his feet, unable to feel when the consistency was right. He built his lifts too thick and too fast, not waiting for proper curing. He skipped the foundation, laying cob directly on packed earth where moisture could wick up from below. And he built the walls only 12 inches thick, trying to save time and material, not understanding that thickness was the entire point. Mary saw the construction and knew it would fail. She told her mother. Constance walked past the Pruitt property, looked at what Samuel was building, and shook her head. Should we tell him? Mary asked. Constance thought for a long moment. I offered to help Henry. I offered to help the Hendersons. I would have helped anyone who asked. Did Samuel ask? No. Did Josephine ever apologize for what she said about us? No. Then we've given them what they gave us. Nothing. I need to stop here and ask you something. Was Constance right? She knew Samuel's walls would fail. She knew the family would suffer for it. She could have walked over, pointed out the problems, offered to help fix them. It would have taken an afternoon. She chose not to. Because they'd never asked. Because Josephine had called her a savage. Because sometimes people need to learn from their own mistakes. But Samuel wasn't building the walls alone. Thomas helped his father every day. Thomas, 12 years old, who had never mocked anyone. Was Constance responsible for what happened to Thomas? I don't think so. But I also think she could have prevented it, and didn't. And those two facts sit side by side in my head, and don't quite fit together. Tell me what you think. I want to know. Samuel's Cobb addition collapsed inward on a night in late October, 1878, 5 months after he built it. The autumn rains had soaked in through walls that were too thin and had no proper roof overhang. The organic matter in his topsoil had begun to rot. The uncured interior hadn't hardened properly. And Thomas, who had been sleeping against that wall because it was the warmest spot in the new addition, woke up pinned under 300 pounds of wet clay and straw. That's when Mary heard him screaming. That's when she stood at the edge of the property for a full minute before she ran to help. When she got there, Samuel and Josephine were making things worse. They were pulling at the fallen section, causing more of the unstable wall to crack and shift. Thomas was screaming that his legs hurt. "My son is trapped, and you'll kill him. My son is trapped, and you'll kill him if you keep pulling. The wall isn't cured, it's not solid. You pull one piece and the piece above it falls." Mary moved closer, studying the collapse. "I need a saw, a wood saw, and boards, anything flat." Josephine stared at her. "What? A saw and boards? Now, unless you want him crushed." Josephine ran. The technique Mary used, she'd learned from her mother after a cob wall repair in Devon went wrong years ago. Uncured cob could be cut like dense cheese. You didn't pull it away, you sawed through it in sections, removing weight gradually while bracing the sections above. She sawed for 40 minutes, removing chunks of wall in careful sequences, her hands red and raw from the work. Samuel held the boards against the unstable sections, following her instructions without question. Thomas was free by midnight. His legs were badly bruised, but not broken. He would limp for a month, but make a full recovery. Josephine looked at Mary when it was over. Her face did something complicated, gratitude and shame and something else, something harder. "Thank you," she said. The word seemed to cost her. Mary nodded once. Then she walked home without speaking. She didn't forgive Josephine. That minute she'd spent watching, that was real. The anger was real. But Thomas was 12, and some lines couldn't be crossed. The next morning, Samuel Pruitt came to Constance's door. His hat was in his hands. His face was exhausted. "I need to learn how to do this properly," he said. "I'll pay whatever you ask." Constance looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Josephine's comments at the general store. You built and start over. All of it. From you built and start over. All of it. From the foundation up. Samuel flinched. That's what proper looks like. What you built is dangerous. It'll fail again. Someone else will get hurt. Tear it down, start over, do it right, she paused. Or don't, it's your choice. But I won't teach you to patch something that can't be patched. Samuel tore down his failed addition. It took him a week. Then he rebuilt, with Constance watching every step, correcting every mistake, making him wait 3 days between lifts, even when he wanted to rush. His second attempt stood solid. It's probably still standing now, if no one's torn it down. Josephine never apologized for what she'd said, never acknowledged that she'd been wrong. She just stopped talking about the Hales entirely, as if the previous 18 months of insults had never happened. Some people are like that. They can't admit they were wrong out loud. The best you get is silence where cruelty used to be. Constance's Cobb cottage stood until 1934, when a tornado finally destroyed it. That's 57 years. 3 generations of her family lived in it, adding rooms and cob construction as the family grew. The walls that Josephine Pruitt said would wash away in the first good rain stood for nearly 6 decades without major repair. Modern cob builders use the same techniques today: the foot mixing method, the lift-by-lift construction, the 3-day minimum curing time, the deep foundations and good overhangs. Everything Constance knew, they've rediscovered. Sometimes from old cottages in Devon, sometimes from buildings in Africa and the Middle East, sometimes from the rare American examples that survived. If this story taught you something about how thick walls hold heat, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We have more stories about people who built things that lasted, and the people who learned from them the easy way or the hard way. And tell me honestly, if you knew someone's building was going to fail and they'd spent months insulting you, would you warn them before it failed, before anyone got hurt? I'd like to think I would, but that minute Mary spent watching, I understand that minute. I understand standing at the edge of someone else's disaster and feeling all the old anger rise up before you make yourself move. She moved, eventually, that's what matters. But the minute was real, and I think she thinks about it sometimes. Clay and straw and water. Walls that hold heat twice as long. And a woman who knew that sometimes the best revenge is just building something that lasts. That's the math. The mercy is harder.